Hi. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and welcome you to the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum and our free monthly lecture program. My name is Angie Grove. I'm the executive director at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. And I'm going to introduce someone who will then introduce the speaker. But before I do, I have to check the website to make sure. I have to give you the dates of our next programs. So first up, you can see the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum's Flex exhibit and interactive station on the road at the Winooski Fiber Fair on August 31st from 10 to 2. And the same exhibit and interactive activity will be at the Old Stone Houses Fall Fiber Fair on September 21st. But our next event here at the Ethan Allen Homestead is on September 27th from 10 to 4. That is our Home and Hearth reenactment. So everyday living in Burlington's oldest house, built in 1785, the Allen House here at this site. And following that, on September 28th, our next free monthly lecture is going to be by Niels Reinhardt, who's an archaeologist and historic resources coordinator with the Vermont State Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec. And he is giving a presentation called Updates in the Archaeology of the Ethan Allen Homestead. It's a little meta, I think. But the summary for that is that we have this wonderful archaeological collection. There's a sampling on the wall right there. Over 10,000 artifacts that were dug up in the 1990s and then sat in our attic for 3 decades. And a number of volunteers, over 200 volunteers over the last 3 years, have inventoried, cataloged, and rebagged and relabeled every single artifact. In fact, one of our amazing volunteers, Colleen, is sitting up here, who did a lot of that work. So thank you, Colleen. And Niels Reinhardt has been a consultant on that project since its beginning. So that project is just now coming to an end as far as the conservation side. And this will be the first showing of the results of the knowledge that we gained that we can then turn into exhibits and programming and educational resources for the public. So please join us for that on September 28th. Okay. I also want to thank our program sponsor for this series, my apologies, which right now is the Burlington Heritage Ford and Toyota. So thank you to them for helping sponsor this program. Okay, so with that, I am now going to introduce the person who will introduce your speaker. Please help welcome a board member, a local researcher, retired teacher, and a friend of mine, Mr. Glenn Fay.
Very love to hear you.
Thank you, Angie. Now if I can just, there. So, former Governor Jim Douglas served Vermont for more than 35 years. He's known for his Vermonty sense of humor, which I've already seen today, his being fearless and frugal. Case in point. Here's a story Douglas tells in his book. His pregnant wife began to have serious contractions late in the evening on February 16, 1980, and she told him it was time to go to the hospital. Hospital billing was based on each calendar day. So Douglas proclaimed, "I'll be darned if I'm going to pay for an extra day at the hospital just for a few extra minutes." Accordingly, he slowly drove from their home to the hospital, and they waited in the parking lot until the stroke of midnight. That is frugal and fearless, I might add. You can read more in his book. The Vermont Way, a Republican governor leads America's most liberal state. In it, you'll hear another story about a very embarrassing situation that happened when Douglas was staying in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House. I don't want to give it away, but here's a clue. The White House bedrooms have no locks on the doors. In all seriousness, the book describes the Vermont way as a governing style that respects differences and views compromise as a positive outcome. Imagine that. On to the accolades. James Hawley Douglas was elected to the Vermont House of Representatives and in a few years served as the House Majority Leader at the tender age of 25. He was subsequently elected Secretary of State and later State Treasurer. In 2002, he was elected Governor of the state of Vermont and re-elected 3 times. Douglas served as the chairman of the National Governors Association and in 2010 was appointed by President Obama to co-chair the Governor's Council. Former Governor Douglas is now an executive in residence at Middlebury College, his alma mater, where he teaches political science of all things. He serves on several boards, including the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. At one time, Douglas served as interim director for the Vermont Historical Society, making him a true historian. We are very happy to have him here at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum Lecture Series to speak about Vermont here. And please welcome former Governor Jim Douglas.
Wonderful to be here. Obviously, I didn't hold back when I wrote my memoir. Complete transparency. But after we slowed down to get to the hospital right after midnight, our son didn't arrive till after 7 in the morning. So, just so you know. And why do you need locks on the bedroom doors in the White House? The whole place is surrounded by Secret Service. But internally, I'll finish the story, Glenn. 3 of my colleagues decided that they really wanted to see the Lincoln bedroom, so they just barged in, and I was kind of partially dressed at the time, but anyway, life went on. Well, obviously I have a bias, I hope you do too, about the great state that we all call home. I think it's punched above its weight throughout the course of our nation's history, and I want to just share a few thoughts about some of the characters who've been part of our history throughout the last couple of 100 years. We might as well start right in because I sometimes get distracted. And if a few folks know who these people are, I'll sign a certificate and you'll get extra credit when you get back to school. No, I guess I don't have that.
Work for retirees?
Yeah, right. I don't have that cloud anymore. There we go. So who are these guys?
The Fairbanks.
Exactly, the Fairbanks brothers, the inventors of the platform scale, Thaddeus and Erastus. Erastus was governor a couple of times, some non-consecutive terms in the 1850s and 60s. He was in favor of prohibition. That's why he was not reelected in the 1850s, but he came back. He came back a decade later and was our first Civil War governor, and he's the one to whom President Lincoln sent a famous telegram asking what may we expect from Vermont, and his response was, Vermont will do its full duty. And of course, that's the title of a book by Howard Coffin, who maybe has graced this podium at some point in the past. But the platform scale, we may take it for granted today, but there wasn't a way to weigh large quantities of agricultural products and other items back before it was invented. And the company is still going today. I think it's owned by somebody out in the Midwest, but these guys were from St. Johnsbury. You know this fellow? His name is more recognizable than his face. He, born in Rutland, was an apprentice blacksmith in Middlebury, He was a deadbeat.
John Deere.
Exactly. So he went out to the Midwest to get away from his creditors. Became pretty well known out there. And a couple of years ago, we inducted him into the Vermont Agriculture Hall of Fame. Well, he wasn't there, but someone from his foundation was to accept the honors. But yes, indeed, John Deere, native Vermonter. Here again, his surname will be more recognizable than his face, but this is a guy from Windham County named Elisha Otis. And Otis was born in, well, I've heard 2 different towns, but somewhere in Windham County. Went over to New York State to work for a bedstead manufacturing company. And one of his employer at the time said, we really need to figure out a way to move our raw materials from the ground floor up to the manufacturing space on the second floor. So he had an idea, as you might imagine. He didn't actually invent the elevator, but what he invented was the safety brake, because the elevators before Elisha Otis came along, you took your chances. You might plummet to the bottom of the shaft. So he put in the safety brake, and at the New York World's Fair, he, to the initial shock but delight of the crowd, got up there on the platform and said to his assistant, "Get your axe, cut the rope," and then it just settled a few inches, and everybody realized that he had invented something pretty nifty. So obviously his name company is still going today. You may not recognize this gentleman, but you'll certainly recognize what he invented. His name is Roger Easton. He was born in Craftsbury, died a decade or so ago. He was a Middlebury graduate in physics, went to work for the Naval Research Laboratory, and initially invented a system of tracking satellites. Initially ours, and then in the late 50s, theirs. Sputnik was launched. But he's most famous for something he invented after that. And it's known today as GPS. So when you are wandering around with your Google Maps or whatever it is, think of Roger Easton, native Vermonter, who was the fellow who invented that. Now, he used to say, oh, it was a team. I'm sure it was, but he's in the Inventors Hall of Fame. And but after he retired from the federal government, he settled in New Hampshire. Actually ran unsuccessfully for governor over there. But I never knew him. I wish I had, but people who did say he was a really outstanding gentleman. Any takers on this fellow? He was born in Thetford in the early 1800s. His name was Henry Wells, and he moved to New York State. Everybody kind of, as Stephen Douglas said, left Vermont to do different things. He worked for an express company along the Erie Canal, delivering freight and packages and mail, ultimately, and to Buffalo. And then he and a few buddies thought, well, I wonder if we could deliver stuff even farther west, like to Detroit or Cincinnati or maybe even Chicago. So they formed a company called Western Express. They later called it American Express. And they were so successful that the Postal Service was feeling the heat and reduced its rates in the 1800s to remain competitive. We can talk about whether they need a competitor today or not. But anyway, that went pretty well for a while. And then he and some of the other partners of the American Express Company thought, I wonder if we could deliver packages all the way to the West Coast, because California was admitted to the Union in 1850. And the majority partners of the company said, that's ridiculous, no way. And remember, at the time, California's population was smaller than that of Vermont. So it wasn't like there were huge cities out there. So maybe their reaction wasn't unreasonable, but they said, we don't want any part of that. So he teamed up with one of his partners, a fellow named William Wargo William Fargo from Buffalo, and formed a company. And not only that delivered a lot of stuff out to the West Coast, but they also began to deliver express products to Europe. So Wells Fargo obviously is still going strong. Somebody calculated, I believe everything I read on the internet, that if you adjust for the value of a dollar over time, Henry Wells was the wealthiest person ever born in Vermont. Maybe so. Sorry, he wasn't my great uncle. Recognize her? Hetty Green, does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, she was a character, wasn't she? Sometimes called the Wizard of Wall Street, sometimes the Witch of Wall Street. She was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Her grandfather and father were whalers, but she married a fellow from Bellows Falls, Edward Green, and spent most of her life in New York City. She inherited some money. She had to fight her aunt in court over getting all of her inheritance. But she became even wealthier. And some believe at the time in the early 20th century, she was perhaps the wealthiest woman on the planet because she was a very savvy investor and very frugal. Glenn referred to that. Well, I wasn't as frugal as Hetty, who famously would not cook all of her meals because she didn't want to use the electricity, but would just eat everything cold. She would launder only the hems of her dresses because that's all that got dirty. There was a story since rebutted that when her son broke his arm, she refused to pay for his medical care. But I don't think that's true. Even with, even now, sometimes the legend goes a little beyond the reality. But she was quite odd, I think it's fair to say, and is buried in Bellows Falls. There was a motel with her name on it. I drove by yesterday, but it doesn't seem to have the name on it anymore. I think it's turned into housing or something. Anyway, Hetty Green, a real character, to say the least.
Dorothy Canfield Fisher.
Exactly. Dorothy Canfield Fisher from Arlington, noted author of short stories, fiction, nonfiction. She spoke 5 languages, one of which was Italian. And she translated Maria Montessori's book and brought it to America and is largely responsible for the spread of the Montessori educational method in the United States. She was involved in a lot of other things, served on the State Board of Education here. She was a Gold Star mother. She lost her son Jimmy, who was a physician in World War II in the South Pacific in 1945. And there were 2 Filipino doctors who tried to save him, and she arranged fellowships for them at Harvard because she was grateful for their efforts. And there's a monument to Jimmy Fisher somewhere off Route 7A. I've been there, but I'm not sure I can tell you exactly where it is, noting his service to our country. A more recent episode with Mrs. Fisher, as I'm sure you know, where the State Libraries Board took her name off a Child's Book Award. I don't agree with that. I think she somebody of whom Vermonters can be justly proud. Okay, who are these characters? Yes, right. A couple of guys who started a little ice cream shop down in, where was it, on the corner of Pine and or St. Paul. St. Paul. Yeah, right. In the old gas station, and the rest, as they say, is history. Their company's had quite a lot of interesting episodes throughout the last few decades, but the brand is pretty strong. Well, I haven't seen eye to eye politically, but they're successful entrepreneurs, and we're glad that they have enjoyed their success here. One area where we've really led historically, I'm proud to say, is healthcare reform efforts. Yes, there's yours truly in there. This is an AARP award event in New York City where they recognized our efforts and deemed Vermont's healthcare reform in 2006 the most progressive in America. Now, 4 years later, of course, Congress passed the Affordable Care Act and subsumed everything. But for a while, we were quite well known. We reduced the uninsured rate by a quarter here. We launched Catamount Health, that you may recall, and focused on wellness. We were deemed the healthiest state in America for 4 out of 7 consecutive years. So I feel really good about it, even though it's somewhat ancient history now. But yeah, I got to hobnob with a few celebs there. That's on the far left is an actor named David Hyde Pierce, right? And Valerie Harper is next to him. She gave me a compliment on the joke I told at that point. And the president of RPI is there, Jane Pauley, and a few other folks. But the point is, Vermont has been a leader there. The governor of Oregon told me right after we passed our health reform measure that he just told his folks to take Vermont's law, change the name of the state, and pass it. And so we were indeed a model. Well, now you'll know who this next fellow is. Are you ready? Of course, he may or may not have looked like that, right? But somebody who is obviously quite prominent in the formation of our state. This fellow you may not recognize. His name is Frederick Haldeman. He's not a Vermonter. He was actually born in Switzerland, but he became an official of the British Empire. He was the governor of Quebec at that point. You see Vermont, what became Vermont, the little green thing in the middle of the map. And the significance of this is that Ethan and his colleagues started talking with General Haldeman about the future and whether we might just like to stay loyal to His Majesty. You know, maybe it wasn't so bad after all to be a British subject, because these Americans weren't too interested in bringing us into this new United States. So why should we keep participating in their Revolutionary War when we're not part of the country? And you know, what do you say? And there were a lot of people in Vermont at the time who were loyalists. So Ethan and others had some secret negotiations. They became less secret when a message was interrupted by a courier and discovered and published. But the significance of Vermont in those days is a couple of fold. First of all, if that remained part of the British Empire, it may be small, but remember New York was either the largest or the second largest state at the time. It wouldn't have been great to have the British Empire just a few miles from Albany or way down into southern New England. And of course we had the issue of the balance of North versus Southern states that was in play at the time. We went to the Continental Congress in Philly several times asking to be admitted, and Ethan and others were just told to go pound sand. So they started talking about remaining loyal to the empire, and ultimately, of course, that's not what happened. But the future of the country was at stake, and largely due to some of the pressure that came at that point. And speaking of pressure, are you familiar with the famous Washington letter in the 1780s? The original is in the state archives, but this is a letter to a congressman named Jones from Maryland, who wrote to retired General Washington and said, you know, we're having all this problem with Vermont. They want to join the Union. We're not sure we want them. Why don't you reconstitute your Continental Army and go up there and take it by force? And Washington wrote back to Congressman Jones and said, I don't think that's a great idea. Because back in the Revolution, some of my best soldiers were Vermonters. I'm not sure we could take them. I'm paraphrasing, but that was Washington's point. And the significance of the letter in the state archives.
You sure this fellow wasn't called Trump?
Oh, no, I don't. You good.
Another day.
Yeah, all right. This presentation doesn't go that far. But what's interesting about the letter is, which we bought at auction down in New York, I hated to pay for it, was that it's entirely in Washington's own hand, because they didn't have word processing, but they did have scribes, so a lot of the early letters were written by somebody else, and then the big guy would just sign at the bottom. But Washington wrote this entire letter in his own hand. So it really gave some credibility to Vermonters and our tenacity. Hamilton's the guy who came up with what ultimately was a compromise. He wanted another northern state because he wanted the capital in New York City, where it was briefly. And he thought, you know, if we let Vermont in, I bet they'd vote for New York over some farther south place. But the problem was, as I suggested, the north-south balance. We had the original 13 colonies had were basically 7 north and 6 south. And if we went 8 and 6, that would be even more disparate. So the deal was that ultimately in 1791, they said, we'll let Vermont in, but we're also going to admit Kentucky and Tennessee. Then we'll have 8 northern, 8 southern states. So Vermont was a key linchpin of this decision. You recognize these guys?
James Madison.
Yeah, and DJ, yeah, and Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, right after Vermont joined the Union in 1791, and Madison, who was a member of Congress from Virginia, decided to take a trip to Vermont. And they wanted to look at this new state and see what kind of flora and fauna we had, and kind of check the place out. So they came up and they wrote about all the flowers and plants and animals they saw. But the real reason they came was to check out the political animals that were here, because things were starting to fracture the Federalists and the Jeffersonians. So they were interested in making sure that this new state was on their team and not the Washington Adams Federalists. And over time, Vermont sort of went back and forth. In fact, you may know that the original name of Washington County down in the Barre-Montpelier area was Jefferson County. Yeah. So, but then the Federalists came back into power in Montpelier and they flipped it, and it's been Washington County ever since.
Weren't they upset with Jefferson because of the pass to Canada?
For Smuggler's Notch, yeah.
Smuggler's Notch?
Yes, that's later, that's right. When he was president, yes, he imposed an embargo on trade with the British Empire.
Right.
And so Vermonters said, yeah, well, I think we got an answer for that. We'll smuggle up through Smuggler's Notch. I mean, they didn't call it Smuggler's Notch. So they evaded the customs officers who were on Lake Champlain, because I figured, well, the only way they're going to trade is by water, right?
Yeah.
Also on that trip, Jefferson more or less invented the maple syrup industry.
Well, yeah, he was a smart guy.
Yes, he was a very smart guy.
And he was intrigued by the fact that you can get the sweet stuff out of trees. So you're
And compete with the expensive sugar that Britain was selling us to put in our tea.
exactly right. So very good. So if we can get it made here, you're exactly right. There's one place that they stayed that's still standing. You recognize this? At Chimney Point, a state historic site. It was a tavern, and they stopped in there for a beer and pretzels or something. I'm not sure they stayed there, but they stopped in there on their trip up and down around Vermont. How about this guy?
Alexander Twilight.
Yeah, first black graduate of an American college, which happens to be my alma mater. First black state legislator, and a great educational leader, of course, up in the Northeast Kingdom. A lot of buildings named for him, one at Linden, one at Middlebury, and his portrait a new portrait was put in the State House lobby just a few years ago. But it's interesting, I read recently where he's the only black person to have served in a state legislature prior to the Civil War. Then there were several from some Massachusetts folks and others. And when I was Secretary of State, I wanted to try to confirm his status. So there is a National Black Legislators Association. So I look it up, I just call and say, hey, I'm a Vermonter, I'm kind of interested. So who was the first black legislator in America? They gave me a name, somebody from Massachusetts. I said, in the 1860s. So anyway, Twilight, major contributor. Are you familiar with Monument Farms Dairy down in Addison County?
Yeah.
So why do they call it that? You know? There must be a monument, right?
Yeah.
Right out in front of the headquarters of the building, right in downtown Weybridge. Don't go during rush hour. Well, it's a monument to somebody, right? Idea whom? Well, a fellow named Silas Wright, who was born in Amherst, Mass. Came up with his dad, who started farming. There's a little sign in Weybridge. He went to Middlebury, then went out to New York State to get involved in politics. He was in their legislature, he served in Congress. In 1844, he was elected governor. I think he'd been a U.S. Senator prior to that. And he was actually nominated for vice president in 1844, but declined. Now, there are a number of people who actually declined that. I mean, hard to believe, right? But over time, and of course you remember what John Garner said in the 1930s about the vice presidency, not worth a picture of a warm spit. Anyway, and we'll get to another fellow who declined it later on. But the real reason I think Wright declined it, not because he wasn't intrigued by the idea, but he was a strong supporter, probably a protege of former President Martin Van Buren, who was a New Yorker. And Van Buren was trying to come back after having been defeated 4 years earlier. That rings a bell. And so he wanted to get back in the White House in 44. And it didn't work out. They nominated James Polk instead. But then they nominated Wright for VP, and he was afraid Van Buren would think that he double-crossed him if he took the nomination. So he declined it and was elected governor instead. That was second choice, vice presidency. But anyway, Silas Wright from Weybridge is why we have a monument there. A U.S. Senator, Congressman before that. Justin Morrill, yeah, from Stratford. The Morrill Land Grant Act, University of Vermont is a land grant college, of course, and that was signed by President Lincoln. He served much longer as a U.S. Senator for like 30 or so years, but it was in the House where he sponsored the Land Grant Act and just felt that everybody, especially in rural America, should have the opportunity to go to college. And so he sponsored that law, giving each state some land to sell, the proceeds of which would be used to form a college or university. Three famous Vermonters, you recognize any of them? Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and Oliver Cowdery, three Mormon leaders. Probably Cowdery is the least well known on the right. He was from the town of Wells. He was the scribe of the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith, obviously the prophet, and Brigham Young, the leader who brought them out to the Salt Lake Valley. Smith from Stratford, Sharon, Young from Whitingham down in southern Vermont, and then Cowdery from Wells. What I thought was interesting is that Joseph Smith from Sharon and Justin Morrill from Stratford were born miles apart, but had very different views on a particular matter of public policy. Morrill, in addition to sponsoring the Land Grant Act, sponsored the Anti-Polygamy Act when he was in Congress. And here's his neighbor, had a very different view on that. But anyway, when Brigham Young died, there was a lot of brief, sorry. Had to throw that in. Anyway, but the major Mormon leaders came from the Green Mountain State. These two fellows? Oh, the other guy? Yeah, Uncle Steve, yeah. No, well, what's interesting is neither Lincoln nor Douglas has any direct descendants alive today. The line died out after a generation or two. This was obviously significant. A local guy from Brandon was the nominee for president in 1860, losing to Lincoln. Lincoln never set foot in Vermont, but we gave him the highest percent of the vote twice. Why, do you think? Because he embodied our values, didn't he? We were the first state to prohibit slavery, and we were really in sync with what he stood for. So he, kind of interesting. And I mentioned people leaving Vermont. Remember Stephen Douglas's famous quote when he said, "Vermont is a wonderful place to be from. Why did you leave as soon as you become of age," or something like that. And I thought, well, we all kind of blunder once in a while, or maybe he had a bad day. But then he said it again, so I think he meant it. So anyway, and if anybody visited the Brandon Historical Society, which is in his home, his birthplace in Brandon, they were starting to kind of de-emphasize Steve. Talked about Brandon during the Civil War and other things. A couple of years ago, the Historical Society there decided on a fundraiser and wanted to put on a play about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and they asked if I would participate. And I said, oh, sure, good cause and all that. And they said, well, you may choose which part you play. And I said, well, I mean, here's Lincoln, here's Douglas. Tell me who else you're going to get, and the taller of the two of us should play Lincoln. So in fact, I ended up being the shorter of the two, and so I'm spouting off all this stuff about how nifty slavery is in my script. I just hope there's no record of that. But it raised a lot of money for the Brandon Historical Society, so I guess that's what counts. This fellow, you may recognize his surname, George Edmunds. There's a school by his name in downtown Burlington. He was a U.S. Senator, and his significance is that he was the one who proposed the solution to the 1876 election dispute. That's where Hayes and Tilden were battling over a few electoral votes, and they weren't sure who was going to prevail. There were 4 or 5 states, mostly in the South, but also Oregon, that had contested electoral slates submitted to the Congress. And so Edmunds came up with the idea of a commission that was comprised of members of the House and Senate and the Supreme Court to come together and resolve that dispute, which they did. And you can argue about whether it was a good outcome or not, but they awarded the presidency, well, the electoral votes and the presidency to Hayes. But the deal was that they would honor the Democrats' wish to withdraw the troops from the South. And arguably with it, Reconstruction kind of took a turn in a different direction. So I don't know. But well, I've already told you about who 2 of these 3 guys are. Rutherford Hayes on the left, Samuel Tilden from New York on the right. Hayes, by the way, has a Vermont connection. His father was from Brattleboro, ran a grocery store down there or something, and then moved out to Ohio, where young Rutherford was born. But how about the guy in the middle? He was from New York State, but he went to UVM. His name is William Wheeler. He was Hayes's running mate in the 1876 election. Generally, tickets in those days had a Westerner, like from Ohio, and an Easterner from New York. So that's what the balanced ticket was for the Republicans in 1876. Well, in those days, the candidates didn't attend the national nominating conventions. They just stayed home, and some delegation would come and tell them that they were nominated. Now, Coolidge talks about getting a phone call in 1920, because that had been invented by then. But generally, they waited for somebody to come and say, hey, guess what? You got nominated by the convention out there. So Hayes got a clue because he was at home with his wife, Lemonade Lucy, in the governor's mansion in Ohio, and heard a ruckus outside, and there were signs that said Hayes and Wheeler, and chanting and cheering. So Hayes turns to his wife and asks, who's Wheeler? They didn't know who the guy was, but they were elected. So, U.S. Senator, Governor, etc. Redfield Proctor, the scion of that family. He was Secretary of War under President Harrison, and had been a governor, and then later was a U.S. Senator. And you probably know there were 4 Proctor governors of Vermont. Fletcher on the left, Redfield Jr. in the middle, and Mortimer on the right. So quite a dynasty, and there were a bunch of other folks who were involved with their business, the Proctor Marble Company as well. But 4 Proctor governors over the course of our state's history. I'm not sure why I threw him in here, but I did. This is John Stewart. He was governor from Middlebury in the 1870s. I guess the only historical note, first of all, his home now is the Swift House Inn. You can buy there. My home will never be an inn. But anyway, but his daughter was Jessica Swift, who lived in Middlebury for 110 years. And I remember she died in 82. I remember talking with her once, and she explained that she remembers as a 5-ish-year-old girl going with her dad on the Middlebury Village Green for the centennial in 1876. And of course, she was there for the bicentennial too, so it was really kind
She was
of,
110?
yes, when she died. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was kind of a shock. I mean, I don't know why we were shocked that she died, but we thought she lived forever. But anyway, quite a lady. This fellow, yeah, Chester Arthur, perhaps born in Vermont. Big story about that, right? But officially from Fairfield. Of course, his dad was an itinerant preacher. Berkshire thinks he might have been born there, and there's another theory that he was actually born north of the international border because his dad had a parish up there at one point. But anyway, nominated for vice president in 1880, and then of course President Garfield died early in his tenure. But what I thought was kind of interesting is that both of these guys, taught at the North Pownell Academy, just south of Bennington. There's a little historic marker out there. Not at the same time. Arthur was a little older, but Arthur had gone to Union College over in Schenectady, Garfield down in Williams. But they both taught at the same little school in North Pownell, Vermont, and then years later ended up on the ticket as president and vice president in 1880. This is Arthur's alleged birthplace in the town of Fairfield. Some think that because a local prominent landowner gave the land and proclaimed it such, that's a little questionable, but it's a replica. Unlike the Coolidge homestead, this is just a replica, but still worth visiting. This is the same guy at different points in his life.
Robert Todd Lincoln.
Yeah, Robert Todd Lincoln, the only surviving son of President Lincoln. He, of course, famously was in Washington when his dad was shot. He was at the railway station when President Garfield was shot in 1881. He was in Buffalo when President McKinley was shot in 1901. So he, at that point, said, "I don't think I'm going to be invited to any more presidential events." But he went on to have a great career in business, and of course, this is his home, Hildene in Manchester. Distinguished-looking fellow from Woodstock.
George Perkins Marsh.
Indeed, George Perkins Marsh, a Whig congressman for many years, and then ambassador to Italy. He holds the record for being the longest-serving ambassador from the United States to anywhere, serving like 20 years, because usually they turn over faster than that when a presidential term changes, but he holds the record. He's buried in Italy, but he's even more famous, arguably, for his book, Man and Nature, when he, back in the middle of the 1800s, said, maybe what humans are doing has some impact on the environment. Maybe just a lot. So he was ahead of his time. Frederick Billings, you see where this is going. Marsh, Billings, Rockefeller, a National Historic Park, the only one we have in Vermont. And we're delighted that it is a national facility. How do you like those mutton chops? Anybody recognize this guy? Levi P. Morton, born in Shoreham. That doesn't help. He was Vice President of the United States from 1889 to 1893. What's interesting, though, is he was urged, or he was considered for the job in 1880, and he said, "Oh no." Kind of like those other folks. I don't think I want that. That's a nothing job, right? Well, if he'd taken it, of course, 6, 7, 8 months later, he'd have been elevated when Garfield was shot. But he said, "I'd rather be minister to France." And so Garfield appointed him minister to France. And they loved him over there, apparently. And he was the first person to climb the Statue of Liberty, first American, back when it was being constructed over in Paris. So they really liked him. But then in 1888, he was nominated and served a term. He and Harrison had a little falling out, and so he wasn't renominated. But if he had been, he wouldn't have won because Cleveland defeated Harrison in 1892. Teddy Roosevelt was in Vermont when he heard McKinley was shot in 1901. He was in Alma with the Fish and Game Club there. He immediately rushed to Buffalo, but they said, oh, McKinley's coming along, he'll be okay, don't worry about it. And so Teddy went back to his vacation, which then next involved hiking through the Adirondacks. Obviously, 8 days later, McKinley died, and Roosevelt was back in Buffalo taking the oath of office. You probably recognize the guy on the right, Big Bill Taft, but the fellow on the left, that's his father, Alphonso Taft, who was born in West Townsend, down in Windham County. He moved to Ohio again, and became a prominent attorney out there. Represented railroads. I actually read a biography of him. It was more about railroads than I really needed to know. He became Attorney General under President Grant, so President Taft had some political blood in him. Pretty easy, right? Our 30th president, Angie or Glenn mentioned that I serve on the board of the Coolidge Foundation. Here's the Homestead. If you're ever in town on the first Saturday of August, we reenact the Homestead inauguration by lamplight. But instead of doing it at 2:47 a.m. when it actually happened, we do it at 2:47 p.m. And for the last decade or so, I portrayed Colonel Coolidge. Not much of an actor, but it's kind of fun to reenact it. Come if you can. There's the store, of course, where he went early in the morning to make a phone call to ask the Attorney General if it's okay if his dad swore him in. Here's Grace Coolidge's official portrait. Coolidge said, I'd rather have her in a white dress, but the artist said, well, we can't have the White House, the white dog, and her in a white dress. So, gotta be something different. So they finally agreed on red. John Sargent from Ludlow was a lawyer there. He was Attorney General of Vermont for a little while. A little older than Coolidge, but he knew the family, Coolidge's dad, and probably young Calvin too. Coolidge's first effort to appoint an Attorney General when there was a vacancy in 1925 was defeated by the U.S. Senate, which is another whole story. So then he said, well, all right, I know somebody unblemished, so he got his boyhood friend from Ludlow, Vermont to come down, and John Sargent was the Attorney General of the United States for about 4 years, and perhaps most notably, he is the most recent resident of Vermont to serve in a presidential cabinet. It's almost a century. About time, don't you think? Anyway, Ida Mae Fuller.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, I don't think I'm on any short list right now. We just noted the 90th anniversary of the enactment of Social Security. Ida Mae Fuller of Ludlow was the first recipient in 1940, 5 years after it was enacted because they had to build up a little kitty. And she busted the actuarial tables because she lived to 100. System's in trouble from the first. She paid in about $25 and she drew about $25,000 for the rest of her life. So anyway, she was a small world. She was John Sargent's legal secretary in his office in Ludlow. So did Coolidge and Ida Mae know each other? She was 3 years younger. Maybe they went to the same school, maybe. Coolidge, of course, would have been appalled at something like Social Security, a big government spending program like that, but he didn't live to see it. Warren Austin, U.S. Senator for a long time from Burlington, first official ambassador to the United Nations, and right after World War II, he was displaying to the Security Council that the Russian arms were being funneled into North Korea and wanted people to know that. He famously sort of made a comment about the Middle East. Remember that? I don't understand why those Arabs and Israelis can't settle their differences like good Christians. Anyway, some say he was slightly misquoted, but not completely. Ralph Flanders, senator from Springfield, he sponsored the revolution to censor Joe McCarthy, his colleague from Wisconsin. He writes about it in his memoir, which is called Senator from Vermont. Interestingly, he said that McCarthy really didn't take it personally with him so much as he did the senators who brought the resolution out to the floor, but he sponsored it, and an engineer, served a couple of terms. Anyway. Connie Bailey, first woman lieutenant governor in America, from Burlington. She served 2 years in the 1950s, and the tradition was that LGs and governors would each serve 4 years and then kind of move on, and they rotated for the east and west sides of the Green Mountains. But Connie, in 1956, said, you know, I don't think Vermont's ready for a woman governor. So maybe I should step out and not run for re-election as LG and put somebody in there who could go on to the governorship. So she didn't run for re-election, and they recruited the Attorney General, who was elected lieutenant governor. His name was Bob Stafford, and then he went on to serve in many other offices, of course, later on. Connie was quite, and she wrote a memoir too. The title is Leaves Before the Wind. I've read it. Can't quite remember the significance of the title, but I think it's a quote from a poem or something. But we did get a woman lieutenant governor, didn't we? First in America to serve 3 terms. Of course, we have shorter terms, and there's no limit, but still, we're proud of her for doing that. I saw her yesterday at Governor Salmon's funeral down in the southern part of the state. Well, these guys, you know, but you know, Madeline will be 92 next month, and slowing down a little bit, but still all there without question. And we've had presidential candidates more recently too, haven't we? 2004, he was leading the polls for a while, and then came Iowa. Well, not really. And of course, you know, maybe he'll run again. What do you think? I don't know. He'll only be 89 at the end of the current Senate term, and then 95 at the end of the next one. We'll see. But anyway, just a few thoughts of some of the people who've been interesting in our history and the impact they've had on the broader country. So I'll stop there and see if you have any more questions.
Is this the first state to allow a woman to go to college?
Well, I didn't know that.
Okay.
Oh, somebody will have to
All right.
look it up. Google it. Yeah, Google it. I don't know that. I don't know. Certainly some, the Ivy Leagues were really slow to go co-educational, which was
First allowed to vote, Vermont.
well, no, I don't think so. Well, maybe because we initially allowed them to vote in town elections. They could vote for town clerks, Gary. They could vote for school directors. So it was limited to, you know, jobs that might interest women, or I forgot how they phrased it at the time. But then in 1920, of course, the Constitution was amended. So Grace Coolidge was able to vote for her husband for vice president, the first time women were allowed to vote. But I don't know about,
All right.
Gary.
Jim, the Google says the first state or territory in the U.S. to allow women to vote was Wyoming territory.
Yeah.
I thought it was 1869.
Wow, quite early.
Yeah,
Thank you.
but not for.
Any other questions Terry can answer? Sure.
Could you say a few things about Phil Hoff?
He, of course, was a member of the House for 1 term in the early 60s, then was elected governor in 1962, the first Democrat in 109 years to win the governorship. And he defeated an incumbent, Ray Keyser, who had served only 1 term. It was a very close election. The design of the ballot has changed since then, and we can make an argument that if today's ballots were used, he might have had more trouble, because in those days you could list your name more than once under different party columns. And so Phil and others formed the Independent Vermonters Party, and he got more votes there than his overall margin of victory. Because the argument is that a lot of Vermonters thought to themselves, I couldn't possibly bring myself to vote for a Democrat, but a fellow who's an independent Vermonter, well, okay. Whereas now, of course, our ballot design is that your name is listed only once, though you could have multiple parties listed after them. And that might have been the reason why that was changed. But he served 3 terms and re-elected in '64 over Ralph Foote, his lieutenant governor, in '66 over Dick Snelling, who would come back a decade later to win the job himself. And then in 1970, Phil ran for the U.S. Senate and lost to Senator Prouty. That was the first really heavy TV advertising race, I think, in Vermont. But Prouty was able to prevail fairly handily by about 60-40 in the end. But then Phil went back to the state senate, the 80s or 90s, I forgot exactly when, and served a few terms there. I don't know that he enjoyed it really, but he came back and we said goodbye to him just a few, 3, 4, 5 years ago, I forgot. But yeah, they talked about him for vice president, but with his Kennedy-esque charm, but it never quite came to.
Interesting.
Any other thoughts or questions or?
I wanted to say about Jefferson and Madison visiting Vermont. There's a painting at the Bennington Museum that they were there at the Walloomsic Inn.
Yeah, that's great.
And that building is still there.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of, back and forth about the shape that it's in, but apparently somebody has bought it. There's hopes that that's going to be refurbished in a way, but the Dewey family, I think it was Elijah Dewey was the one who owned that. His father was Reverend Jedediah, who was the first minister down there in Bennington. So.
Right, as I understand, they did indeed stay at the Walloomsac Inn in Old Bennington,
Yeah.
we call Old Bennington now.
Yeah.
And it's really been quite run down.
Yes,
But
yes.
I guess it's going to be revived, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Just like the Equinox Inn in Manchester was pretty run down for a while, and then someone came along and revived it. It's interesting, when Jefferson and Madison were on their tour, they observed the blue law, or whatever they called it back then. They refused to travel on Sunday. So wherever they were on Saturday night, they just stayed for the whole next day and wouldn't move on till Monday. Today's Sunday, isn't it? I guess
You refused to have the child on a Sunday too.
well, but he came.
You gotta wait till the next day.
That was a Saturday night. He was born Sunday morning.
Okay.
And our next son came on a Saturday, but it wasn't as dramatic a experience.
But what are they gonna do with the Bennington Battle Monument?
Oh, I don't know for sure, but it was on the TV the other night, right? It's apparently deteriorating, too much moisture there, and they've got to somehow fix it. I mean, it sounds like an expensive proposition.
Right.
So I don't know, but yeah. It was interesting, it was started, or the design finished in 1877 on the sort of centennial of our Republic period, and then finished in 1891. President Harrison came for the dedication, and young Calvin Coolidge came over from Plymouth Notch to hear President Harrison. He was in awe of seeing the nation's chief executive speak at Bennington. But yeah, I guess the monument's in tough shape now. So. But I haven't heard they've closed it. I think you can still go up. Is that right? But
It's the stone that's deteriorating.
yeah, it's a shame. But that's I think the most visited state historic site. Coolidge Homestead right behind it, and it kind of drops off after that.
I've got an odd one, but when did Vermont turn so racist against blacks in particular? We were part of things early on, but my God, what I've seen since, was there a trigger, or was it just the lack of population that moved here?
Well, I guess, I think we are, really?
I run into a lot of neighbors,
think so.
and even some government workers.
I'm surprised,
Not we are.
I think sometimes the negative people are more outspoken in different areas than
That could be true.
media.
Certainly, I'm sorry we've become so polarized now, and I think part of it is the, social media and stuff like that that's got everybody grumpier than we used to be, but,
I mean, yeah,
I don't know.
word of mouth.
Well, we need to kind of, boy, what do you think? Oh,
Oh, I'm sorry. Wasn't Aiken, he was quite prominent, wasn't he?
yeah, I didn't want to take any more of your time, but yeah, I could have talked about Senator Aiken and others. He was Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor, Governor, and then U.S. Senator for 34 years.
Yeah.
Longest serving senator until Pat Leahy came along. But Aiken famously spent $17 on his last re-election in 1968, and so that was only for postage to send in my petitions. But he was the ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee. He famously said, President Nixon should declare victory in Vietnam and pull out. But he's that was speaking of polarization. He and Mike Mansfield, the Democratic Majority Leader, had breakfast every morning when they were together in Washington, best of friends, and it was an era when people got along. And I showed a picture of Senator Flanders from Springfield. In his memoir, he says the same thing. There was nothing that was partisan. And he served from 1959 to 71. He said nothing passed without strong support from both sides of the aisle. Nothing important. So it's just hard to read that today and think about what it's like.
So what's your prediction for the future?
We're doing
Maybe we'll, we could use a port like Montreal. Maybe we could. Well, I was spending a lot of time with our Quebec friends back when I was in office, and great people, great relationship.
One thing I read, someone said, don't bring up the War of 1812. In other words, Canada invaded America to Trump because Trump will start invading Canada.
Well, I'm hoping not. But yeah, I don't know. Obviously, we're not as big a deal in relative terms. As I mentioned, in 1850, we had a larger population than California. We had 6 members of Congress at our peak in the first half of the 1800s, and then we started whittling down. The 1930 census got rid of our second member of Congress, and I don't think we're going to see another one ever, probably. So we're a lot smaller than we used to be. We still get 2 senators like everybody else, till and unless they go after that. So I don't know. I think it may be, again, based on personalities, and we've got folks like Dean and Sanders who were quite prominent. Jefferson and Leahy, both and Stafford, all chaired Senate committees and had some clout in their own rights. So as long as we still have 2 senators, I guess we'll be able to hold our own. Roy.
First of all, thank you for your presence, your ongoing presence. The fact is that when you decide to go to heaven, we're going to still remember you, okay?
Hope it's not soon.
I don't know if you get to decide that.
My question is triggered by the statement that outside influence. I'm recalling that the lady mentioned Wyoming when you were head in Governors Association. I had great conversation with the then governor of Wyoming. And in our conversation, when you had the conference meeting here in Vermont, in our conversation, he was saying, of all the 49 governors, I like and respect Governor Douglas the most.
That's right.
You know, that was a powerful statement. It's consistent was then and now. Consistent with outside influence. And as I think about that, the impact that a few can have, I'm curious to know what some of your thinking might be in terms of how do we package this outside influence? When I came to Vermont going on some 40 years ago, I thought I'd be here possibly 4 to 6 years here, wife and I. But people still ask me, you know, hey man, you're black, what are you doing in Vermont? It's not a color thing, but my response has always been, and still is, because my experience is more positives than negatives. It's not to say that we're perfect, you know, I mean, I live 6 minutes from the meeting place of KKK here in Franklin County. From Burlington, there is a 61-minute drive to a summer resort for the KKK. One of the black families living in that area hears them every weekend target practice. The fact is, the boldness there is so strong, so they've stopped by his home and asked him to join the KKK here in Vermont. But that's reality. It's not pushing rhetoric or trying to be provocative. The reality is we aren't all perfect, but there are some perfectly positive things we can do as members of this one human family on planet Earth. So back to my question, you know, if you look at that outside influence and the potential therein, you know, what's your feeling or even suggestion as to how do we package that power and make a difference, especially in this void now where a lot of people are fearful, a lot of good thinking, solid folk have ideas, but they won't speak up because of retaliations of various sorts. So as we look at this impact that the still state has had on the other, not only the other 49, but in other places globally. So if you want to share the motivation on this Saturday.
Well, that's a great invitation, Roy. I'm not sure I have a brilliant response, but you triggered another thought that Governors Snelling, Dean, and I all chaired the National Governors Association at one point during our tenure, so we've tried to provide some leadership where we can there. I think we just continue to live Vermont values and show the rest of the country what it's like. And we've got some stress now, obviously, as other places do, but if we continue to work with one another and engage in positive civil discourse and realize that we can disagree agreeably, then perhaps we can set a model that other people will look at. That's one reason I got involved with the Coolidge Foundation is that Coolidge was a debater at Amherst College. You might think, you know, he never said anything, but he believed strongly in the importance of hearing different points of view and having an honest and open debate. And so we have a high school debate program at the foundation for kids all across the country. And it's wonderful to see them engaging in that. So I think we just continue to live our Vermont values, and I hope we can make a positive contribution. But food for thought, Roy. Thank you.
Governor Douglas, are you going to be here if people have further questions? Are you going to be able to stick around for a few minutes?
I think I might.
Okay. So with that, I would like to say a few thanks to people before we finish the program. First, thank you to Chittenden County Historical Society, President Karen Gould right back here, for providing the cake for their refreshments. It is their 60th anniversary this weekend, and they sponsor the community activities that some of you may have seen when you first walked walked in as well. And also thank you to our volunteers, Margaret and Ginger, who also provided some of the refreshments. And thank you to CCTV/Town Meeting TV. Charlie here is recording the program, so it'll be available on YouTube. And they record all of our free monthly lectures, so you can go back to our YouTube page and watch the backlog. A lot of the people that Governor Douglas brought up on the presentation, we have a whole 60-minute lecture on them on our YouTube page, so go check it out. But primarily, please join me in thanking Jim Douglas for his presentation.